Hello everyone, my name is Hailey Elizabeth, and if you don't know who I am, I post videos pertaining to a little bit of whatever I want. Conspiracy theories, controversial people, true crime, vlogs, just a little bit of everything. So if you're interested in any of that, you can subscribe, and if not, totally chill. You don't have to subscribe to have a good time. Like, we are just here to do some makeup, talk about some true crime. And for today's case, we are going to be talking about the case of Seath Jackson. Now, there is a lot to get through, so we're just going to hop right into it. But before getting into the rest of today's video, I do want to give a big thank you to the sponsor of today's episode, SCENTBIRD. Now, if you guys don't know what SCENTBIRD is a fragrance subscription service with over 600 different perfumes and colognes, including unisex, just for $17 a month. They have designer brands like Prada, Gucci, and Versace, and more indie brands like Skylar and Confessions of a Rebel. SCENTBIRD is also very flexible, and you can easily skip a month with no penalty or even upgrade to 2 or 3 bottles a month. This month from SCENTBIRD, I received Good Habit by Rise, L'amour by Brown Girl Jane, Whispers of Truth by House of Solage, and Rêve d'Infini by LIPGLOSS. With each fragrance, you get a 30-day supply, so you can really test out the fragrance before committing to a full bottle. Usually when it comes to fragrances, I'm the type of person that more goes towards like sweeter smells, but this month I decided to try out some more florally scents, and oh my god, I am so glad I did. And it's great that I was able to like test those out without committing to a full bottle. And one of my favorite things about SCENTBIRD is how convenient their bottles are. Like, this is my everyday purse, and this is my everyday perfume, and every time I try to put it in there, there's like no room. But with SCENTBIRD, it fits in there with literally so much more space. And if you're like me and you keep everything under the sun inside of your purse, SCENTBIRD is what you need to get. And if you guys want SCENTBIRD for yourself, all you need to do is click the link down below and use my code Elizabeth2 for 55% off your SCENTBIRD subscription. That's only $8 your first month. Only available in the US and Canada. And again, I want to thank SCENTBIRD for sponsoring today's video. Now back to your video. Seath Jackson was born on February 3rd, 1996 in Summerfield, Florida. He was born to his mom, Sonia, his dad, Scott, and his 2 older brothers, Scott and Steven. As a kid, Seath was described to be the type of person that always loved to make people laugh. He was super kind. He had such a great heart. And he also really enjoyed wrestling and actually had dreams of going into the UFC one day. His family described Seath as sort of just average. He wasn't super popular to where he had tons of friends, but he also wasn't super shy. He was just basically an average guy. Seath was also described to be a very big animal lover and loved to be outside. One of his favorite things to do was to go on his 4-wheeler. But not only did he love, you know, just being outside and being in nature, he also loved being inside too and playing the card game Yu-Gi-Oh with his friends. That was literally his favorite thing. And he completely just was like a typical kid. He played with his Yu-Gi-Oh cards, he hung out with his friends, he loved hanging out with his family. But all of that would unfortunately change when Seath was 14 years old, and that's when he began dating Amber Wright. And the couple actually stayed together for a long time, an entire year, and people said that at first their relationship was really cute, they really flourished, and they seemed like a very happy couple until the end of their relationship when things started to get extremely messy. Amber Wright was just overall not a good influence on Seath. Seath, before meeting Amber, he had never even like been introduced to drugs or alcohol, but that was something that Amber did a lot. And then that's when Amber would kind of introduce Seath into the lifestyle of partying, drugs, and alcohol at just 14 years old. Amber mostly hung around with the wrong crowds, especially her best friend, 18-year-old Charlie Ely. Charlie Ely actually had her own place. It wasn't really her own place, it was like a trailer that her parents had owned, but both of her parents were in jail. So it technically was her place, and because of this kind of became like the designated hangout spot every time the group would get together. Charlie had a total of 3 roommates, and all of these roommates were also also like her friends that her, Amber, and Seath would frequently hang out with. And these three people included 16-year-old Kyle Hooper, who was also Amber's half-brother, 18-year-old Michael Bargo, and 20-year-old Justin Soto. These kids tended to sort of live the same lifestyle as Amber, a lot of drugs, alcohol, and partying, and it was mostly because they just all came from very troubling backgrounds. Kyle, while he was living with Amber, because as I said, like, he is her half-brother, he was actually kicked out of the house due to his substance abuse issues. Justin as well had a bunch of juvenile arrests for things such as possession of a weapon on school property, battery, and burglary, and same thing with Michael. He had a criminal history of possession of a weapon, a restraining order, and burglary. And so since these were Amber's friends, when she started dating Seath, these also became Seath's friends, and over time, you know, you tend to reflect the people that you surround yourself with. And so because of this, since Seath was, you know, hanging around people who did all these drugs and alcohol and crime, he kind of went into the same way. So that is when Seath stopped hanging out with his friends. He stopped doing the things that he enjoyed doing, like playing Yu-Gi-Oh, going on his four-wheeler, hanging out with his family. He also started to argue with his family a lot and have a lot of resentment towards them. And so Seath overall was just kind of being influenced a lot by Amber and her friend group. But in March of 2011, that is when Amber would break up with Seath. But right after she broke up with Seath is when she would start dating 18-year-old Michael Bargo, Charlie's roommate. So Seath started to connect the pieces, and he's like, okay, there's no way that they would just start dating, like actually intimately dating each other if they don't know that much about each other. So that means Amber was most likely cheating on me with him when we were dating. In early March, that is when Mike had posted to his Facebook wall saying things to Amber like, quote, "I already miss you, BBG, love you, Amber." And this was posted while Amber and Seath weren't like dating, but they were just kind of going through a rough patch within their relationship. And on March 28th, that is when Amber had posted to her Facebook wall just the word done. And then after that, Seath had posted, quote, "Single, hit me up now that I don't have a trick," with his like number attached. But although he seems to be very like nonchalant, as if it's like not really affecting him, Seath did have a very long time best friend named Will. Best friend Will knew Seath through and through. He knew the type of guy that he was deep down, and Will said that after his breakup with Amber, he completely shut down. He was not the same person afterwards. It really affected him a lot because if you think about it, like Seath had basically built his entire life and personality upon Amber and her friend group. And so the fact that he doesn't have that anymore, even though before it was like 90% of his life, he's completely lost. He doesn't know what to do. He was struggling a lot with like self-identity issues, but also trying to go through a breakup that he's just now finding out that he was cheated on during it. April 8th of 2011, that is when Seath took to his Facebook to say that he was single once again, and to this created like a argument between Seath and Amber on each other's Facebook walls. Amber and Seath just began to talk about their personal business openly online, calling each other really disgusting names, as well as just airing out their personal business just online, including one post in particular where Seath had called out Amber for using meth. Now, a little bit of backstory about Michael Bargo. Michael Bargo, aka Mike, moved to Florida 2 years prior, but he did unfortunately grow up in a very abusive household. Since he grew up in an abusive household, Michael tended to have very bad anger issues. He would lash out quite frequently. And at just 16 years old, that is when he ran away from home. He dropped out of school and he just began couch surfing. Mike needed needed money, but he needed a lot of money quickly, and so that is when he just sort of resorted to crime. And then over the next couple of years, he would begin to build his criminal record. He was arrested twice for burglary, had a restraining order on him, carried a .22 caliber revolver wherever he went, and Michael also hated Seath. I mean, obviously he was Amber's ex, but the main reason why Mike hated Seath so much is because Amber had told Michael that Seath would physically abuse her all the time, and that is the reason why she broke up with him, because he was just getting way too violent. And so because of this, you know, Michael thinking that Seath is a woman beater, he absolutely despised Seath. He wanted nothing to do with him. Michael would frequently talk about his hatreds towards Seath to all of his friends, including his roommate, aka Amber's half-brother, Kyle Hooper. But not gonna lie, Kyle had some valid reasons for not liking Seath, because Kyle recalls one time that he had this girlfriend named Alyssa that he actually really loved, and then one day when he came home, he caught Seath and Alyssa hooking up. Their online fights would just get worse and worse, and now they weren't just fighting about like personal issues and being petty with one another. That is when Michael had actually entered himself into the argument with Seath and Amber, like all over Facebook, and he was actually talking about physical violence towards Seath. And Seath, he was not afraid of Michael whatsoever, and so he decided to bring their online drama to real life. Seath had actually found out through a couple of friends that Michael and Amber were going to be at this specific house party, and so he decided to go in order to confront Michael in person about all the drama going on, and also just fight Michael, because Michael had been talking online saying, you know, like, it's on site, when I see you, you're gonna get it. And then Seath was like, okay, if I'm really gonna get it, then give it to me. And so he goes to this party, he confronts Michael, and from people at the party, people would say that Seath, quote, laid him out at this party. He basically just fought Michael in front of the entire party, but apparently Michael didn't really know how to fight with just fists and no like guns or knives. And so because of this, he basically just embarrassed himself in front of the whole party. Seath had brought him down, and this absolutely killed Michael's ego. And not only did Seath beat Michael in front of the entire party, he also beat Michael in front of Amber. And so this whole situation made Michael extremely angry. And then on Sunday, April 17th of 2011, it was a normal day, and usually Seath would be with his friends because, as I said, at this time, Seath wasn't really hanging around with Amber or her friend group anymore, and so because of that, he just started to rekindle his old relationships, like with his old friends, and so typically he would be spending most of his days with his friends, either playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Or video games like he always used to. On this particular day, Seath was hanging out with his best friend, Will, but what Will didn't know was that day, Seath had been receiving non-stop text messages from Amber. Amber basically saying that, you know, she wants to get back with him, that he's like her one and only, just basically confessing her love to him all over again, reminding him of all of the great times that they had together. But Seath, at this point, he was kind of healing from everything because, as I said, Amber had really just wrung him out. And so at this point, he was just so tired, but at the same time, he really did love Amber and he did have a soft spot for her. So he would respond to her throughout the day. Will notice that Seath seemed very irritated, very agitated. He kept on looking at his phone all day and he just seemed distracted. And so that's when Will suggested, hey, why don't we go over to Brittany's house? Because Brittany was one of their friends. They were like, it's fine, like, we'll get your mind off of it, we'll watch a movie, it'll be fun. And so Seath agrees, and Seath and Will go over to Brittany's house. But when this happens, it doesn't really help Seath at all because Amber is still texting him. Now, Will doesn't know that Amber is texting Seath. He doesn't want to pry about what's going on. He's just kind of like letting Seath do his thing, but he can clearly tell that something is bothering him. And so after, you know, hanging out with their friends, they go to walk home that night, to which again, Seath is on his phone. He seems agitated. He doesn't want to make him more angry, so he doesn't say anything. And then that is when the boys part ways to go home. But unfortunately, that would be the last time Will will ever see Seath. So basically what the text messages were between like Amber and Seath, she was also trying to get him to come to Charlie's trailer that night just so they can talk and hang out. Seath, as I said, he was healing. He didn't want to see Amber, and so he kept on declining all of her offers. Also thought that it was very odd and ungenuine about her quick change of heart. He honestly felt like it was a trap. After literally all day long of Amber asking him, eventually he was just like, okay, whatever, I'll go. There was even one point in the text message conversations where Seath told Amber that he was scared to show up to Charlie's trailer because he was convinced that he was gonna get jumped, to which Amber eased his nerves and said, no, I would never let that happen to you. After Seath and Will part ways at the end of their walk, he walks over to Charlie's trailer, but what he didn't know was that inside of the trailer was not just Amber, but it was also Michael, Charlie, Kyle, and Justin, and they were all about to execute a premeditated plan to murder Seath. The next day, on Monday, April 18th, 2011, that is when Seath's mother noticed that Seath never came home the night before. And this particularly concerned her because, as I said, Seath on the outside was like this very hard, you know, tough guy. But on the inside, he was a big mama's boy. And so it was very odd for Seath not to let his mother know if he was coming home that night or if he was just coming home late. So the fact that he said nothing to her and didn't show up at all that night, it really concerned her. She tried to contact Seath, but there was no replies, and then eventually, as it got later and later in the day, she decided to call the police and file a missing persons report. Then the day after that, on Tuesday of April 19th, 2011, that is when Seth's disappearance started to show on the news. On this day, that is when Kyle was watching the news with his mother, and then as he was watching, that is when Seth's missing case came up. And for some reason, Kyle watching Seth's mother cry on television about the loss of her son and everyone extremely worried about where he is and what happened to him, this just made Kyle feel so overwhelmed and guilty. And so that is when he went to his mother and confessed to her that the night before, him and his friend group had murdered Seath. Explains the entire story to his mother from beginning to end, but within the story he does tell his mother that he had nothing to do with it. All he did was watch, and so his mother told him, you know, you should not be telling me this, you should be telling a police officer this. And so that is when she takes Kyle to the police station. That day, Amber, Charlie, and Justin were all brought into questioning. However, Michael Bargo, he was nowhere to be found. The police tried to find him at his home, but he wasn't there. They tried checking like a couple of friends' homes. He also wasn't there. So it was very clear that he was hiding. The investigators decided to put all of the kids in different rooms so they could really hear each of their individual stories and they wouldn't be relying on each other for information. And their hopes for doing this is they hope that by the end they can compare the kids' story to try to find some inconsistencies, and if there are any inconsistencies, they will bring all of the kids together in one room and basically just confront the inconsistencies or the lies in front of everybody. So starting off with Justin's interrogation, Justin at first was very, very closed off and pretended like he barely knew anything that was going on, that he was barely involved, and he even referred to to Amber as, quote, Charlie's friend. And when talking about Seath, he said, quote, the little white boy. I think his name is Seath or something. He also attempts at just distancing himself from the group altogether. He says that he barely knows anybody in the group or really talks to anybody. He's just sort of there as a roommate, and he doesn't really talk or know anybody that well. And then when it comes to his whereabouts on Sunday, he gives very, very vague answers. And the detective sees right through this. She clearly sees that, you know, Justin is trying to hide something. There is no way, with the amount of time that Justin has lived there and with the amount of times that Amber and Seath have come over to the house, there's just no way that Justin just wouldn't be friends with them or wouldn't know more about them. Justin at this point didn't have a job, so it's not like he was out all day. He was home for most of the day, and so the detective saw right through this. And so that is when she attempts at a different approach to try to get Justin to talk. And so she tells Justin that actually they have everyone else in the other interrogation rooms and they're asking, you know, them the same questions, but everyone is actually blaming everything on Justin. And so if he doesn't tell the truth of what actually happened, he's going to be going to jail for something that he didn't do. And so the detective leaves him with an option that he could either go to jail for the entirety of the crime or just the section of the crime that he was involved in. And immediately you can tell that this scares Justin, because after the detective says that, he just says, quote, wow, well, since you put it that way, here's what happened. And then he pursues to tell his side of the story. As far as Amber's interrogation, Amber is accompanied by her mother because Amber at this time was only 15 years old, same age as Seath, and so because of that, her being a minor, she had to be accompanied by an adult such as her mother. Amber says that that night on Sunday, her and her friend Charlie went to go meet up at the corner of Seath's friend's Brittany's house. She says that it was around 9:30 p.m. and since it was dark outside, that's the reason why Charlie came with. She said she met up with Seath. The two of them talked for about 30 minutes, just about everything, their day, their relationship, how they feel about one another. And after their 30 minutes of talking, that is when they decide to part ways and Seath goes home while Amber walks back with Charlie to go back to Charlie's trailer. But an hour later, Amber says that Seath randomly shows back up at the house. And when he shows back up at the house, Charlie is the one that opens the door, and to this, Seath tells Charlie that he wants to speak with Amber again. Charlie lets him into the house that him and Amber can talk, and her and Seath start talking for a little bit until Amber says that randomly Kyle just gets up from the couch and starts hitting Seath, like starts beating him up. And so because of this, Charlie and Amber get very, very scared, and so they run to Charlie's room. They said that from the room, all they heard was a bunch of screaming, thumping, 5 to 6 gunshots, and then after the shots went off, there was just silence. Amber said that within the silence, all she could hear was Kyle say, quote, what did you just do? And they ended up being way too scared to come out at all, and they stayed in Charlie's room until the very next morning. As you can tell right away, this is a very big situation. This is definitely very traumatizing, something that you're not going to easily forget. And so if this did indeed happen, Charlie would definitely have the same story as Amber. As for Charlie's interrogation, for the most part, Charlie's story is identical to Amber's story, so it's speculated that maybe the two girls had gotten together to make sure that their story was right. But there's no such thing as a perfect false story, because they did catch a lot of big gaps and holes in Charlie's story. In Charlie's story, she said that on the night of Sunday when they met up with Seath, her and Amber actually walked to her street corner to meet up with Seath, not the corner of Brittany's house, to which that is what Amber said. Also, in Amber's story, she told police that the next day she didn't see Michael at all because Michael just stayed in his room. But in Charlie's story, she says that she actually did see Michael the next day, to which Michael said, quote, "I swear if you guys open your mouth about anything last night, I'm gonna come after you guys." So those are all of the interrogations thus far. Now let's circle back to Kyle's interrogation. So as I said, Kyle is more of the weak link, I guess, of the group. Although he seems to be telling his story, the police tell very, very quickly that he is leaving out big parts. He's not completely telling the truth. And the biggest part that the police notice of like Kyle's story is that he says that he has no part in it. He said that all he did was watch. He didn't actually engage in anything, which is completely false. They know that although there may be false parts, his story most likely has a lot more truth than anyone else they have heard from today. Kyle then tells the story of that Sunday and says that that morning he was hanging out with his friend Brandon at Charlie's trailer, and then that is when Michael came in and he started snorting some crushed up white pills. Said he didn't really know what these white pills were, but shortly after Brandon left, it was now Kyle, Amber, Charlie, Justin, and Michael, just like the usual people at the house. After Michael had snorted up these white pills, he began to get extremely fired up and then followed it up by saying, quote, "Man, I want to go on a killing spree tonight. I just want to. You guys down?" To this, Kyle says that everyone started to agree with Michael. Nobody thought that that was crazy. Nobody thought that that was odd. They were really going along with it. Throughout Michael talking, he kept on saying that if they actually did, Michael would 100% take the blame for everyone. They would not need to go to jail. This is just something that he wants to do, and since it was his idea, of course he would take the blame for it. Kyle does not say that he is completely innocent, though. He does confess a little bit by saying that he did indeed hit Seath over the head 3 times. Although Kyle seemed to be telling the most truth out of everyone there, it was not the full truth that the police were looking for, and so that is when the police decided to put all of the kids into one room and just monitor how they interact with each other. But they didn't let all the kids into the room all at once. They thought that it would be smart to put Amber and Kyle into a room at first. And as I said, Amber was sharing the room with her mom. And so when Kyle walked into the room, that is when Kyle tells their mom, quote, "Both your kids are in for murder. What we told you wasn't the story. I mean, it was planned. Everything was planned. Everybody." After this, that is when Kyle starts to mention a new name to the story, a guy named James. Now, the detectives don't know who James is or where this James comes in from, but they do take note of it. And then shortly after this, that is when the mother is asked to leave the room. Then that is when at first just Charlie enters, and then about 20 minutes later, Justin enters as well. And it wasn't until when all of the kids were in the same room together where the police really started to know the actual story of what happened that night. What they were saying, it seems like Michael was the ringleader of this whole operation. He was the one who had the idea. He was the one who said he was going to take the blame. On that morning, after snorting some pills, he had proposed the idea to Justin, Charlie, Amber, and a new person to the story, 37-year-old James Younghavens, former stepfather of Amber and Kyle. What is this former stepfather, 37-year-old man doing hanging out with 15-year-old kids? I have absolutely no clue, but he is entering the story. Michael did indeed propose the idea of a killing spree of like who they were going to kill and that he would take all the blame for it. And for some reason, the whole group was just on board. There was about like 5 or 6 of them, and none of them even said like, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this. Nobody stepped in and said, that's extremely messed up. We shouldn't be doing that. We could actually go to prison. None of them thought any of that. They were just completely on board with the idea. So then after a long talk, and again with Michael telling the whole group that he was indeed going to take the blame for everything, that is when they started to figure out who exactly to kill, and shortly after they decided to kill Seath. It was Amber's job to lure Seath to Charlie's trailer, and she was going to lure him with him being under the impression that they were going to get back together. This eventually did work, and then after he went to Brittany's house instead of going home, he did just indeed go straight to Charlie's trailer. Police also found phone conversations the night of the murder between Amber and Seath that read at 7:58 p.m. Amber had texted Seath and told him to meet her at the corner of Charlie's trailer. And then when Seath showed up, Amber told him that the only reason Charlie was there was because it was dark outside and she didn't want to be waiting for him in the dark. And so that is when she suggests, you know, since it is dark outside, we should probably take this conversation inside of the trailer. To which Seath at first was like, no, I don't know about this. Like, I think this is a setup. But Amber and Charlie just tried to like ease his mind and say, no, this isn't. Don't worry. We would never do that to you. And so that is eventually when they were able to convince Seath to go into Charlie's trailer. When Seath walked into the home, Kyle was indeed sitting on the couch and Michael and Justin were in their rooms, but when they walked in, Amber told Kyle, can you leave for a minute while I talk to Seath? And so I guess that was like their cue or something, because shortly after that, Kyle immediately got up and went to Michael's room. It was in this moment where Kyle said that he started to feel nervous about the whole thing and he really started to get second thoughts, because actually seeing Seath there in person just made the whole thing 10 times more real. He tried to express this to Michael, even saying, you know, Michael, we shouldn't go through with this. But Michael had reminded Kyle that Seath had gotten with Alyssa as well as abusing his sister Amber, and this is something that should, you know, have consequences. And on top of all of that, Seath had even fought Michael in front of a whole party of people, making him even more embarrassed. At that time where they had gotten some sort of cue or signal from Charlie and Amber, and that is when the two of them walked out of the bedroom and they started to beat Seath with blocks of wood as Amber and Charlie ran to Charlie's room. Kyle hit him over the head 3 times while Justin also came out of his room and hit Seath over the head 1 time. Seath immediately jumped up and ran for the door, but Michael came out of his room with a gun and shot Seath in the back twice. Seath was still able to run even though he was shot, and at this point when Charlie and Amber started to hear the gunshots, that's when things became extremely real for them. They started crying. They didn't want to leave the room because they were scared of what they were going to see, and they also didn't want to call the police because then they would be incriminating themselves. All they could really do was just cross their fingers and wait for it to be over. Seath was actually able to run to a nearby road in order to get some help, but eventually Justin was able to catch up with him, tackle him to the ground, and then when Seath was on the ground, that is when Mike would continue to shoot Seath multiple times. This portion was definitely labeled as what's called an overkill, meaning that you are shooting someone way more times than needed in order to kill them. And that's exactly what Michael was doing. Mike was literally just shooting Seath over and over again to the point where Kyle had to stop him and even screamed, quote, stop it, just let him go. And then at this point, Michael and Justin had went inside and made Kyle drag Seath inside of the trailer. Michael went into Charlie's room where Charlie and Amber were just sitting there crying. Michael had went in there with a gun in his hand and saying, quote, I love you both, but if you say anything, I will kill you both. When Kyle had brought Seath into the home, that is when Michael had taken Seath's body and dragged him out to the bathtub. Michael had placed Seath in the bathtub and instructed Justin and Kyle to clean the blood that was in the living room and the kitchen, while Charlie and Amber had prepared a fire outside in order to burn Seath's body. Kyle said Michael had shut the door to the bathroom so they couldn't really see what was going on, but all they could hear was Michael, quote, talking psycho. He was yelling, he was cursing, and there was also more gunshots with silence following them. Michael was in there for about 20 minutes, and at this point Seath was indeed dead. And so once Michael knew that Seath was dead, that is when he walked out of the bathroom and told Justin and Michael to dispose of Seath in the fire outside. But instead of just disposing Seath into the actual fire like how they were supposed to, Michael seemed to be having too much fun with this, disgustingly. He was doing really weird and unnecessary things to Seath's dead body. He began pulling out several of Seath's teeth. He broke both of his kneecaps with a baseball bat. He was playing with his tongue and even hit him with a shovel. Michael then put Seath into a sleeping bag and then dragged him outside. That is when he got the help of Justin and Kyle to throw Seath into the fire. And Justin was in charge of staying outside and checking on the fire to make sure that Seath's body was actually burned and there was nothing but fragments left. And so Justin basically just had to sit there and physically watch Seath burn to ashes. While Justin was outside looking at Seath's body, that is when everyone else just went back inside and they were celebrating. It was said by Justin later on that everybody was inside. He could hear them just laughing, listening to music, drinking, talking, basically celebrating what they had just done, while Justin had to sit out there and watch what they had just done. And so eventually Seath's body burnt to ashes and bones, and the very next day, that is when James Haven was called to help dispose of the ashes and the bones. James did indeed help the kids fill 35-gallon tanks of Seath's remains and throw them into a nearby lake, and then furthermore helps them clean up the last of the bloodstains in the home, like the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom. All of this story that I just told you was said while the kids were in the room together. Like, they told none of this to the police. This is basically the story they were saying to one another, and they have no reason to lie to one another because they were all there. And so the police really know now that this is what happened and that James is actually way more involved than what he was saying. So once the police are hearing all of this, that is when they know that Michael is definitely the ringleader of all of this and that he is purposely trying not to be found. And so that is when the police start up a manhunt in order to find Michael. And they do eventually find Michael about 80 miles away, lying low with, you would never have guessed, his girlfriend. Not Amber, his other girlfriend that he was cheating on Amber with. Once he was found, he was indeed immediately taken into questioning. As for Michael's interrogation, it turns out that it was very, very similar, like his story was very, very similar to Justin's and Kyle's. So surprisingly, with Michael, very similar to Kyle, Michael felt very, very guilty about his actions. He couldn't deal with what he had just done, and so he needed to confide in someone, and that is when he had basically confessed to his girlfriend's dad and his girlfriend's dad's girlfriend about the killing of Seath. But he did not give them the full factual story. He said that he shot a guy 8 times because that man had SA'd his little sister, aka Amber. He couldn't just flat out say that guy actually SA'd my girlfriend, because then they would think, oh, you mean our daughter? So not only does he confess to the actual crime itself, he also tells them that they had a friend named James that helped them put Seth's body in a nearby river, and they tied these gallon tanks with cinder blocks so that they would sink straight to the bottom, and he knows exactly where they're at. While Michael was getting interrogated, that is when Charlie, Amber, Kyle, and Justin were in the other room all together, and they were basically just outing themselves out, confessing everything. And then as they were all in there, that is when one detective came in and basically just called them out and said, these are the inconsistencies, this is why I don't believe you, and I need a story right now, because if I don't have a story, then all of you guys are going to jail for something that you may or may not have done. So that's why I need the truth. And so that really scared all of them. As I said, these kids are ranging from ages like 15 to 19, like they're teenagers. So of course they're gonna cry, they're gonna buckle up, they're gonna get scared. But nonetheless, they did indeed open up to the detective about enough, not the full story, but it was enough to where that day, Justin, Michael, Amber, Charlie, and Kyle were all arrested for the murder of Seth Jackson. And later on, James was also arrested as well for being an accessory to murder. As far as the trial, all of them had separate trials, but all of them were pleading guilty to their crimes. So Charlie, Amber, Kyle, and Justin were all sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of Seth Jackson. Michael, however, pleaded not guilty, which was odd because he was the ringleader of all of this. It was literally his idea, and he was at first going to do life in prison, but the jury found that Michael's actions and state of mind were so evil and sinister that they wouldn't trust him around any other human beings, and he was actually sentenced to death, giving him the title of the youngest person on death row in the state of Florida. Usually at these trials, the family of both the victim and the criminal are there, but as for Michael's family, he actually told his family, especially his mother, not to come, saying, quote, "I don't want you there." Michael was sentenced to death while everyone else was just sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. But as for James, James was actually charged with an accessory to murder, but was deemed not fit to stand trial. And it took him a whole 5 years in 2017 where he finally had his trial because he was deemed fit to stand trial. And that is when he was sentenced to max 30 years, and if he does fully live out his 30 years, he will be released in 2047 at the age of 73 years old. As far as the aftermath of all of this, Michael actually in 2014 attempted to appeal his sentence, but it was denied, and as of today in 2023, he is still on death row awaiting his sentence. As far as Charlie Ely in 2020 was given a retrial on the claims of an ineffective defense team and accepted a plea deal and was released at the age of 27 years old with time served after only doing 9 years when she was supposed to get life in prison without possibility of parole. So as for Charlie today, she is out on the streets, she's living her life. It's believed that since then she has changed her name. As for Kyle Hooper, he did attempt at a retrial in 2016 to which he wasn't given parole like Charlie. Instead, he was just given like a new sentencing. He was now given life sentence with possibility of parole in 25 years. And so if he does live out those 25 years, he will be able to be released in the year 2041 at the age of 45 years old. As for Justin Soto, he still lives out his life sentence today in prison. He hasn't attempted for a retrial or anything. As for Amber Wright, she also, very similar to Kyle, got a retrial back in 2016, and she was given the same exact thing as Kyle. She was now given life in prison with possibility of parole in 25 years. And so same thing with Kyle. If she does live out those 25 years, she will be released in 2041 at the age of 44 years old. Some detectives about the case argue whether or not Michael or Amber was the ringleader of this operation. It seemed like Michael came up with the idea, but Amber was the most persistent with it, because Amber, she, that entire day when convincing Seath to come over, she could have stopped herself. She could have said, you know, this is wrong. I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't be manipulating him to come over. I shouldn't be, you know, doing this. It just feels wrong. She had the entire day to wake up and realize what was going on. She had the entire day to stop begging Seath to come over, to just accept his decline, but instead she pursued because it seems like this is something that she wanted. All of this just could have easily been avoidable, you know? If nobody said anything, if everyone just went their separate ways, all of this could have been avoided. And Seath really, from what we see, had done nothing wrong to this friend group. The only thing he did wrong was sleep with Alyssa, but even that story, there's really no like concrete evidence for that. We're basically just taking Kyle's word on it. He had never, you know, misguided them. He was never disloyal to them. He loved Amber. He worshipped Amber. He was willing to get back together with Amber after everything she had done to him. He even fought for Amber in front of an entire party. Like, that's how much he loved and cared for Amber. Further proving that, like, he would never do anything wrong to purposely hurt this group of people. But yeah, that is the end of today's video. If you guys found this video interesting, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you want to follow me on any of my socials, like my Instagram, that will be linked down below, as well as my PO box if you want to send me anything, and as well all of the research that I use for this video. So all of the interrogations that I mention, if I mention any articles or quote anything, all of that will be linked down below. So if you want to go ahead and do your own research about the case, you can use that as a starting point. And if you do go ahead and do your own research about the case, and if you find something that I didn't find in my research or that I simply just didn't say, make sure to leave that in the comments below, because I'm pretty sure everybody here will be very interested to hear what you have to say, and as well, all of the makeup that I put on my face. So if you're wondering what the lip is, what the liner is, what the foundation is, all of that will be linked down below for you to check out. My look today was definitely inspired by Lana Del Rey. I don't know if you've ever seen that picture of her where she has the above liner, the eyeliner, and the water liner. I just think it looks so pretty, so I decided to recreate it today. Yeah, that's all from me. Nothing really to report over here. Make sure to go outside today, get some fresh air. Today it is blue skies, which kind of sucks because I have so much to do. I wish I could be outside, but make sure to go outside today, get some fresh air, get your vitamin D, make sure to do some self-care today, take care of yourself, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, I love you, and do something that makes you happy today.